Welcome to Networking RX, a podcast devoted to helping business professionals like you enhance your networking skills in order to become more proficient giving and receiving quality business referrals and improving the overall quality of your life and the lives of those around you. The Networking RX podcast is a production of AmSpirit Business Connections, an organization whose mission is to empower business success through networking.
Welcome to the Networking RX podcast. I'm your host, Frank Agan, founder and president of AmSpirit Business Connections. Today, we have another great guest. As our ongoing subscribers know, often on this podcast, I'll be sharing ideas, insights, best practices for building those professional relationships and excelling at business networking. Occasionally, however, I will be interviewing subject matter experts, authors, speakers, thought leaders, social scientists, and these people will share their knowledge to help us better understand relationships and how we can make our networks better. Today, I have I'll call him a special guest, and I'll explain why in a minute. Greg Jenkins is a dedicated and passionate diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant, and a lifelong learner. Greg successfully completed 28 plus years with the U.S. Army that range from duties overseas in Germany, South Korea, combat duty in Iraq, and as well as some stateside assignments that culminated in Washington, D.C. While he was still in uniform, Greg's performance leading military equal opportunity efforts resulted in developing a model program for the U.S. Army's equal opportunity. So anyhow, he's special because we went to high school together. Greg and I graduated high school, little tiny Houghton High School in Houghton, Michigan. Go Gremlins. We just, through the wonder of social media, kind of reconnected and got reacquainted. And when I found out what he was doing, I was a little taken back. Diversity, equity, inclusion. He's a white guy. He's just, and you see a lot of people playing this space, and it's not white guys. And I guess let's get into the story, Greg, how you got into this. It wasn't by choice, but I think by choice you're staying with it. So.
Yeah, that's a good way to characterize it. And Frank, thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it. And yes, you're right. Go Gremlins. It's it's wow, what a blast from the past. But good to be here. So yeah, that's a good place to start as to how I got into the space. And Frank, as you said, I would have never had this. Never did I have this on my radar. This wasn't some kind of professional endeavor that I sought out. It really came from the United States Army and their decision to offer me an opportunity to learn about equal opportunity and diversity and inclusion and those kinds of things. And to tell your audience, when I first learned that I was going to get this, quote unquote opportunity, because the Army, doesn't ask you a lot of things. It tells you what you're going to go do, which is fine. My reaction to that was, I don't want to do any of that. Because my perception at the time was that, they're equal opportunity, diversity, inclusion. These are programs that I assumed were exclusively for women and minorities. And what I learned through that process was that's absolutely not the case. That was my perception of it. And there is great value in understanding those topics and how it can help create better leaders, which in turn can build better teams and better, more inclusive and higher performing teams and organizations. So I went in unwillingly and came out the other side extremely willingly, and have been doing this work since 2005 ever since.
That's a great story. And you and I have talked a couple times, and when we originally talked, I was kind of taken back. My wife, she doesn't work in HR, but she works in executive compensation, which is kind of a cousin to HR, if you will. And she talks about equity and diversity, inclusion officers, the things she's seeing in corporate America, because it's becoming I don't want to call it a fad, but it's becoming mainstream, I guess is a better way of putting it. And a lot of women, a lot of people of color, minorities taking on those roles. And in my mind, okay, that makes total sense. And so when you told me this, it was like, well, wait a minute here. You must have a tough way to go in dealing with this. But that's not the case.
No, it's not the case at all. I mean, the arms were open from the beginning in terms of people and organizations that do work in the space, and it's been such a wonderful professional and personal surprise that I mean I really love what I do, and I don't want to stop. And I think if we take a step back and take a look, this isn't flavor of the month kind of things here. We have always been a changing demographic in this nation and in planet, in the world as well. And that's not that, that didn't happen overnight. It's always been happening, and it's going to continue to happen. And so how do you, as an organization, let's say, as an example, well, how do you attract various talent from various populations, get them to come into your organization, accept an offer for employment, and then once you get them in the door, how do you put them on teams and get them to work together well, and so they stick around and they provide value to your organization? Really, that's kind of a big part of the work that I do. It's not the only thing. There is a business case to this, obviously, but then there's also the case of how people have been treated historically. And, there's a well-written record of how that happens in many nations, not just our own. So how do you take a changing, shifting, growing demographic and help leaders and organizations capitalize for themselves and for those employees and for their business?
No, I think that's, this is certainly an important topic. And before we hit record, I kind of hit you with what I'll call one of my many dumb jock metaphors or analogies. And, thinking back to our high school, our graduating class was about 99, maybe a little less anyhow, about 99 people. But, it's 99 people in our graduating class. In my town where I live in Columbus, the suburbs, Gahanna, the high school's got 700 people. They literally have more people in a class than our entire athletic conference. So who's going to have a better football team? Well, we were terrible anyways, but who's going to have a better football team? Houghton High School or any school in America that's only got 100 kids in their graduating class, or a Gahanna Lincoln or another school that's a behemoth like that. Well, the behemoth is always going to win. Why? Because it's got the bigger population. It's got the bigger pool. And in my mind, that's the argument for diversity and inclusion. Is that anytime you start to draw from a bigger population, you're just going to end up with a better result. Go ahead. I'll let you comment.
Yeah, you're right. You're right on the money. I mean, you have access to more talent, to more people. And, so if we were, using, a sports context, we would have access to potentially better athletes. If we're looking at it from a business standpoint, we have access to better potential talent within those larger numbers of populations. And if I'm an organization and I am more comfortable finding talent out of the pools of people that look like me, I can do that. And there'll be talent in those pools of people, but I am missing potentially other talented people in other populations. So how do I get beyond the regular places in which I find talent? And for some folks, they're not sure how to do that. Or am I going to do it correctly? Or, am I going to make mistakes? How do I communicate with folks that are different from me that I haven't normally connected with? How do I bring them in? How do I make them feel like they're part of the team and included? It's the world we live in today.
Yeah. Well, and that's the tie-in I see to this particular podcast is, how do you do that? And it's not just for corporate America. I think it's true of really entrepreneurs as well. If customers are the game, right? I mean, revenue's the game, customers, clients are the game. It's the game for you. It's the game for me. It's the game for everybody in business. And to the extent that you have a limited population, you're going to have a cap on what you can do, just like you would have a cap in getting particular talent. So I guess my question is, how does somebody go about, how do you coach people on, hey, these are some things you need to do to diversify what you're tapping into, networking into?
Yeah, it's a great question. How do we do it, right? What's the first step? What do we do? And I think there's really there's a two-part answer here. And the two parts are what's thinking in the context of what's internal to the organization. So what's inside the walls of the company, as an example, if we're going to use a business case, and then what's outside the walls, the marketplace, right? Okay. So I think a thing that we all run into and we all contend with, whether we realize it or not, is our own biases, both our conscious biases and our unconscious biases. And if you're a human being walking on the face of the earth and any corner of it, you have it. And that process, that system has, in large part, kept us alive for a long, long time as a species. So there's a value in biases. There's a value in our brains being these really, really adept at identifying patterns from a basic standpoint, just to stay alive. But the thing is that in the modern age, when we're not living in caves and contending with woolly mammoths and saber-toothed tigers and, warring tribes of other cave people, we don't need to have those biases erupt so much, but they still are there. So one of the ways that we answer the how do we take the first step is, first of all, understanding about who we are ourselves and understanding that I have a bias, you have a bias, we all have a bias. A lot of times when I'm having conversations with leadership, or I'm delivering, a piece of training or something, there's a stigma that, well, I can't be biased because my understanding is that bias is a bad thing. And I'm here to tell you, friends, bias is a fact. And understanding that we have those systems and processes in our brains is the first step in how do we get past them. So it's really this basic understanding self first. And then once I've gained a little bit more understanding of how a human being will function, now how can I understand about others as well? And then we can start to pluck apart, well, gee, where do you find your talent? Who do you coach? Who gets mentored? Who gets promoted? Who gets recognized and rewarded? And if we're not conscious of those biases, we can take a look at a lot of studies over a long period of time where we are going to lean towards those people that are very much more like us. Mm-hmm. Nothing wrong with people like us. It just is that there are other people in the space not so much like us, and how much of our energy, our leadership, our resources are going to everybody, not just the folks that may happen to look like me.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's back to my metaphor. When we're buying into our biases, we're pulling together a football team based of young men from Houghton High School versus looking at a whole conference or a bigger high school, is really what it comes down to. Now, from the outside, dealing with the outside, are there ways that you coach your groups, or not your groups, but your clients to, here's how you, I mean, if you go to a room of white guys and say, hey, refer in talent, who are they going to be referring in? Assuming that, they live in a homogeneous neighborhood or area or suburb. It's almost like we're stuck in a pattern, and you got to break that somehow or another.
Yeah, that's a good way to say it too. Right. It is a pattern. And our brains are very, very good at identifying those patterns. And we're comfortable in those patterns, especially if those patterns have worked for us for years or decades or centuries in terms of, our businesses in certain cases, right? So it's kind of like, well, if everything's working fine, then why do I need to change anything? Which is often a conversation that comes up. Well, things are okay. The bottom line, we're meeting it, we're doing things. Well, there's an argument for that. That's true. However, I think if you're an astute business person, you got to understand that the way things are today does not necessarily mean that's how they're going to be tomorrow. Mm-hmm. And so what is happening in the environment around us? Have we done an environmental scan? What is happening with the market in which we sell our goods and services in? Are there changes happening there? Because if there's changes happening, are we paying any attention to them? Again, goes back to this bias thing. So if I'm locked into this pattern and it feels really good and comfortable to me, I really don't want to get out of that pattern. And that's where the kind of more difficult conversations can occur. Because you know why? Because I don't want to be perceived as being racist, and I don't want to be perceived as being sexist. So I don't know what to say. I don't know how to say it. So I'll say nothing at all because everything seems to be going good enough. And, I don't know how long good enough is going to last for you, because you can be missing out on, again, women, other particular ethnicities that bring talent and perspective and come from those marketplaces that you may want to either expand in or get into in the first place. So we got to have those kinds of conversations.
Yeah, no, I agree. And again, it's one of those things where it probably creeps up on you, or it will creep up on businesses. I'll just be direct. It will creep up on businesses where they're drawing from that smaller pool. Everything's fine until a competitor who's drawing from a larger pool, back to my metaphor, starts winning more games, starts really dominating. And that's, in a way, I don't know, in a way, that's the argument against affirmative action, of being solely fixed on, okay, this is all we're going to do, because then all of a sudden you're looking at a smaller pool. It's not an easy answer. I'm not against affirmative action, but it's there. You have to be careful, because then you're looking to a smaller pool, and we see the NFL having to deal with this right now. They're looking to have more Black coaches, be better represented. Mm-hmm. And the argument is, well, it's hard because there isn't a pool to draw from. Well, there's not a pool to draw from because historically there haven't been Black coaches, Black assistant coaches, so it's this rut that they're in, this self-fulfilling prophecy, and it just needs to it needs to really make an effort to, no pun intended, but to coach people up to the level, or they'll always be stuck there.
Yeah, absolutely. If we're not building the pools of talent that will feed into into a higher level of the organization, if that's not being put in place, you're never going to have a diversity of people to draw from once we get to the level of, in your example, head coach as an example.
Yeah.
Because we haven't built that into the system that we have. And we are changing. If you look at the latest US Census that came out in August of last year, the data is right there, and that is a huge data set. We have, white populations are declining.
Yep.
And people of color are increasing, and there's nothing nefarious there. That's biology happening.
Yep.
If you look at just one particular data point as an example of how people are changing and how they are identifying themselves. In 2010, there were 9 million Americans that, in the census that identified themselves as being two or more races. 10 years later, that has increased by over 260%. There are almost 34 million Americans that now refer to themselves as two or more races. So if I'm paying attention to that, and I should be paying attention to that the way that we identify ourselves as Americans is changing and shifting. And it has been since the inception of the US Census. For example, the first census was in 1790, and every 10 years hence, we have, as a nation, as a federal government, we have changed the labels many times of how we categorize different people by different titles. And so this is nothing, like I said at the beginning of this conversation, this is nothing new. It just is the way that we identify ourselves through immigration, through how we decide who we want to love and produce children with. It changes. And if we're paying attention to that as a business, as we're using in this example, we would want to, well, gee, how do people identify themselves today? So when I think of my parents, I picture a white man and a white woman. That's what they look like, right?
Yeah.
But for a young college graduate coming out of school, applying for a job at company X, and when they think of mom and dad, mom might be white and dad might be black. And that is their life and that's their reality.
Yeah.
And are we communicating it in such a way that we are respecting and honoring their identity, their reality?
Yeah. Well, like you say, it's nothing new. I forget who had shared this, but they were talking about, it was a YouTube video, but they were saying, way back in the day when we were first colonizing this country, we're first coming to this country, it was mainly people from England, and then I think the Dutch came along. And it was like, God forbid you marry a Dutch boy, right? You do not, we do not intermix with the Dutch, and then 20 years later, it's like, well, it's just us, right? We're just one people. And then the Germans come along and it's like, oh my God, you don't cohort with the Germans. Mm-hmm. And then it's just us, and these are very white populations. Mm-hmm. And, now it's a different time. And we're going to get through it, right? It's going to be us, the Somalians, and it's all going to be, I love America. It's the great melting pot. And I think that's our strength ultimately, because you do have this diversity of thinking, of culture, and you just end up with a better result. So get off my soapbox here.
It's our reality. It reminds me of, my last 4 years I spent in the Pentagon, and we were designing and building and launched the Army's diversity program. And if you've ever been in that building, it's almost kind of like a museum. There's a lot of artifacts and very interesting things that are in the 17 miles of hallway in that building. And that's not an exaggeration. It's right. A huge place. And there is a picture of a World War I veteran, and he's holding his birth certificate, and it says for his race, German. Mm. So again, we have changed how we identify and codify how we want to classify people. And, that's a component of this conversation, that's not the whole thing.
Right.
How are we going to we want to invite people to come into our organizations to be their fullest self, regardless of their skin color, their ethnicity, their religious preference, their sexual orientation, their disability, their veterans, whatever that is. I want you, for your talents and your desire, to work in my organization because you want to be part of the mission, vision, and values of this organization. Yeah. You are welcome to come on in the door, and I want you to feel that way.
Yeah, I had a conversation with our friend Sajal Thacker. Shout out to Sajal, who we both know. Yep. But she was kind of asking, she was interviewing me on my thoughts on this topic, diversity and inclusion. And I gave her an example. I said, if I were stranded on a deserted island mm-hmm. with 3 other people, just all men, 3 guys, just to kind of simplify it. One's black, one's Jewish, one's Indian. I use as an example because she's Indian. Sure. Yep. I said, my sole focus is for us to survive. Right. I don't care about your skin. I don't care about anything. I don't care about your religion. I don't care what God you believe or don't believe in or anything like that. It's all about doing the best and surviving. And I step back from that, and I kind of say the same thing with business. It's about surviving. I told her, I said, I don't have the luxury to decide who my clients are. And I never have. And I don't want to. And I think the people who are having the toughest time with this concept of diversity and inclusion have the luxury to avoid it. But eventually that luxury is going to go away. Eventually the reality is going to come crashing home.
Well, I think it's crashing home right now. If we started talking about the Great Resignation, yeah. I have had multiple conversations with women who are now professional, well-educated career women who are working from home, doing their jobs, and they don't want to go back to the office. And I remember this one woman in particular, and I'll call her Mary. And Mary is a Black woman. And she says, if I have to go back to my office, I think I'm going to go find another job, because I don't get inappropriately touched. I don't have to hear inappropriate comments on the way to work, at work, and the way home from work.
Yeah.
And she said, my stress levels are so much, decreased. I'm still producing the same level of work. I feel happier at the work that I'm doing. And that's an example of other very similar conversations, particularly among women of any
Sure.
color. And I'm thinking to myself, like, wow, we really should be paying attention to this, because this is a high quality, well-talented, well-educated professional who's telling me in this conversation, I will not go back to work for this company if I'm made to come back into this office, into that office. Yeah. So there's obviously a problem here in this office, and according to Mary's experience in it. So that's a really, really important piece of feedback. And if we're paying attention, business leaders, we should be going like, what's going on when our employees are so averse to coming back into this building? There may be a problem in the building. We should probably take a look at that.
Yeah, no, I hear you. Let's shift gears here to kind of wrap this up. But I guess let's talk about your business real quickly. I touched on it, but what you're doing, who are potential clients, how the listeners can help you, and then certainly best way to get a hold of you.
Absolutely. So I am Greg Jenkins Consulting. That's the simplest name I could come up with when I was determining how I wanted to identify myself. So I work in the diversity, equity, inclusion space. And that work entails, there's kind of a large tent, if you will. So, from assessments to strategy development to training development and delivery, executive coaching, setting up mentoring programs, those kinds of things. And really, we're oftentimes associated with HR functions, oftentimes not. Oftentimes it's, we're working with leadership development. And it's amazing how much leadership development there is in the diversity space. And I like to, even when I was going through, my process at the Defense Equal Opportunity Management Institute, and that's a big mouthful. The acronym is DEOMI. And by the way, for your listeners, if you're wondering how long has the military been involved in this work, it's over 50 years now. And I remember going through that process, that education, and I kept thinking to myself, like, wow, this is just such great leadership education. And so a lot of the work I do is in that space as well. It's just helping leaders. I'm not trying to make you a diversity activist. That's not my point. What I'm trying to do is, you as a leader, as an example, we'll just use leadership, is you're in a position of leadership. Let me share with you some best practices, lessons learned, and some tools that can potentially help you become a better leader. So that's where I focus a lot of my work as well. You can find me on LinkedIn. You can find me on my website. Everything is Greg Jenkins Consulting. So if you just Googled that, you would come up with all the things that have my name attached to them. You can reach me 24/7, and we have worked in all across all industries, North America, and in some parts of the world as well. So,
well, I appreciate your time today.
Yeah, thank you, Frank, so much for having me on. I appreciate the conversation.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll talk again.
All right, thanks, Frank.
Thanks for joining us on the Networking RX podcast. Please put what you've learned into action today, and let us know if you have questions, comments, or ideas for future topics. You can email them to us at podcast@amspirit.com. That's AMSPIRIT.com. Finally, so you never miss an episode, be sure to subscribe to the Networking RX podcast through iTunes, Overcast, or however you receive your podcasts. Now get out and network with someone.
The Networking RX podcast is the copyright production of AmSpirit Business Connection. All rights reserved.